Great. Well, happy to be here, and thanks to Ben for inviting us. I just wanted to kind of give a rundown of the how the U.S. left has responded to the upcoming election, which you may or may not have heard about. Um, Most of the U.S. left, I would say, is organized within this group, the Democratic Socialists of America, which has about 70,000 members, climbing up to 80,000, actually, I've heard recently, which is actually, pretty small compared to the population of the United States. But for the United States in the last several decades, it's a pretty significant number of people. The general mood of the country in the polls, seem decisively in favor of a Biden victory, but there's definitely a big fear of Trump refusing to leave office in some sort of coup. But in reality, I think any such election theft would be like completely consistent with the undemocratic constitution. The only coup likely is perhaps one similar to the George Bush victory in 2000, where in the aftermath of the conservative Brooks Brothers riot, the Republican Florida Supreme Court refused a recount, which would have handed the election to Bill Clinton's Vice President Al Gore, despite the candidates only being separated by something like 530 votes. While the alarmist view of Trump in the bourgeois liberal press is pretty hegemonic, it also seems to have infected sections of the left, especially after nearly a year of the COVID crisis. The left has seemingly come to kind of accept, at least in part, an exceptionalist view of Trump as more uniquely dangerous than previous Republican presidents. So I would say that the U.S. left has kind of always been divided between the parliamentary cretinism view and the anti-parliamentary cretinism view, and you can kind of see that within the DSA as well. But as far as the general, maybe a broader view of the left, some people would consider Bernie Sanders' 9 million supporters part of that, which is down from his 12 million voters in 2016. Although Sanders' defeat came a little bit more quickly this year because of, so the way the U.S. election works is kind of strange because we have states that have different contests on different days, but some of the high population states were after he had been defeated. So he probably had more supporters in those states that didn't get the chance to vote for him. But these 9 million or however many million people who were supporting Bernie Sanders are not united into a single organization. The Democratic Party is not a membership-based party like you have in Europe. And there's no way of really gauging their positions, which could run anywhere from left liberal to people who consider themselves communists. And actually, a lot of younger Bernie supporters do now consider themselves communists. There was a poll about the favorability of the word socialism that the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation ran, and hard to trust their methods, but there was something like 15 or 16% of people in some age group, maybe 18 to 29, actually had a positive view of the word communism, which seems kind of a significant number to me. But just a quick overview of the U.S. left that's not DSA. There's, as you and the readers of the Weekly Worker will probably know, there's crisis in all these different Trotskyist parties, the ISO, the CWI section, of course, but there are some sects that are growing as well. I would say the Marxiist Party for Socialism and Liberation is becoming popular with the younger Stalinist crowd. The Grantite IMT also seems to be growing, possibly the IWW, the Wobblies. The publication Left Voice of the Argentine Fourth International Tendency, I believe, has been finding a big readership, but they don't have a section in the US yet, although it seems like they're probably going to start one soon. There are various Maoist and Black nationalist groups that are popping up. And there's also a group called the Marxist Center, which is a new kind of big tent federation of small independent far left groups all around the country that had their first national the meeting where they all decided to affiliate in November of 2018, which my comrade Donald Parkinson and I covered for Cosmonaut. Um, let's see, and then to the DSA's right, there are also various Sanders-based organizations or Sanders-inspired organizations that probably consider themselves progressive but not socialist. And as well, the Communist Party to DSA's right seems to be growing, but they're probably even less socialist than the previous groups I mentioned, seeing as they wrote in favor of Hillary Clinton in 2016. Also, many of the college students for Bernie groups actually transitioned into the DSA youth groups chapters, which was an interesting thing, probably good strategy on the DSA's part. So in a sense, the DSA represents progress in that the left is abandoning the old microsect forms and joining a single organization. CWI, when they exploded, one of their groups turned into a DSA faction. Many solidarity people have gone into the DSA. ISO has tons of people who went into the DSA, but the DSA lacks a programmatic unity in which people can actually, work their ideas out into a kind of practical thing. And their practice politically is coalitionist to the state and loyalist to the Democratic Party, even in parts where people claim they're actually opposed to the Democratic Party. Its far left critics are correct in pointing this out, but the left sectarians usually have a kind of one-dimensional and kind of moralistic critique rather than one that can actually lead to some kind of Marxist party with a program and an independent ballot line. And it's based on the myth of the party of the new type, vanguard organization, because they don't actually want a mass Marxist party. Last night we were lucky enough to have Ben join us for a Cosmonaut group where we read the head-to-head at Halle about Zinoviev and Martell's debate with the Independent Socialist Workers' Party in Germany in 1920. And I was thinking about how Zinoviev and the Bolsheviks did not want to abandon the winnable sections of the USPD over. The USPD, of course, had kind of very contradictory politics between its left, right, and center. And I think that's similar to the DSA. And I believe Marxists should work to win over the winnable sections of the DSA to a Marxist program. So on the election itself, I know you guys are probably very interested to hear about this. Actually, only a right-wing minority of DSA is in favor of Biden, although they probably grew because of the COVID pandemic. They're grouped around the Harringtonite old guard, Michael Harrington, who started DSA, whose goal was to realign the Democratic Party to a Labor Party, and they're called the North Star Caucus, and they have an affiliate called Socialist Majority, which is also same politics. I don't know why they have a different name, and they have like 3 or 4 out of I think 11 or 12 votes on the National Political Committee, the NPC. Differences are pretty much generational on the U.S. left. Most of the the new left veterans of the 1960s and 70s are likelier to be the ones advocating and disciplining leftists for not getting behind Biden. But also, these are the people who have the academic careers and big names and are able to get published in the bourgeois press, the New York Times, The Nation, other stuff like that. It may seem like DSA is all in for Biden, but it really is kind of a sectarian smear because this group is really a small minority. There was an open letter to the new left from the old new left published in The Nation, and it was signed by 80 or so ex-members and founders of 1960s Students for a Democratic Society, and including many prominent names, many of whom are current DSA members. They invoked the sectarianism of the third period German left to chastise DSA, specifically its young members, for not backing the quote unquote capitalist Democrat versus and that's a small d Democrat, versus the proto-fascist. To the credit of Jacobin magazine, they promptly published a response by their editor Daniel Finn, defending what's called the Bernie or Bust resolution, which was passed in the August 2019 DSA convention that said DSA would not endorse or work for a Democratic presidential candidate that was not Bernie Sanders. So Daniel Finn reminded readers that one of the prominent signatories, Todd Gitlin, quote, urged anti-war protesters to stay off the streets and fall in line behind John Kerry in the 2004 presidential election. Another incident of this is the anarchist translator of many texts of French communism, Mitchell Abador, took to the New York Times in May to chastise DSA for passing the Bernie or Bust resolution. And when this resolution passed, it was not very controversial at the convention. It passed with a clear majority, but it has been kind of contentious since COVID. At some point between August and March, when COVID started, the Socialist Majority Caucus people, these are the Harringtonites, brought a resolution to the National Political Committee to urge DSA members in swing states to vote for Biden. The majority on the National Political Committee, including the majority faction in DSA, which is associated with Jacobin, which is Bread and Roses, they voted it down. Bread and Roses is really the only nationally organized caucus, and they had a general majority at the 2019 convention for most resolutions. And you people are probably familiar with the writer Eric Blanc, who is a member of Bread and Roses and one of their chief strategists. More on him later. In early October, an open letter went around to DSA members collecting signatures that urged a coalition with the quote broader left progressive movement that might determine the outcome of the election, and said, quote, it is quite possible that mass mobilization in the streets and civil disobedience in the halls of power could make or break a serious authoritarian turn. So the people who signed it pledged to volunteer time to phone banking, text banking, door knocking, and otherwise to defeat Trump. So this was mostly moved by the Socialist Majority Caucus people, but it also included a few prominent Bread and Roses leaders, which signaled a kind of split within that faction, including Eric Blanc and one of the National Political Committee members who had voted the earlier Biden resolution down, who was a member of Bread and Roses. And apparently the vast majority of this faction, Bread and Roses, is not very happy with some of their leaders defecting to ask that socialists support Biden. So their factional journal, which is called The Call, published arguments for and against in this Biden debate. Let's see. So yeah, so to me, it just seems like this Bernie or Bust thing was much more popular in DSA before the COVID crisis, although it still does not have a majority. You can see it's kind of causing some fault lines in Bread and Roses that are kind of exposing the politics of people like Eric Blanc, who have maybe covered up this liquidation into the Democrats at least a little bit before. In the historic conjecture and anxiety of the pandemic seems to have shifted more people in the nation generally, but in the left as well into the Biden camp. And Eric Blanc is not the only non-Harringtonite who defected towards supporting Biden. Dan Labatz is another prominent member who was from Solidarity and Labor Notes, prominent Teamster, historian of the Latin American left, third camp Trotskyist, who opposed a DSA Sanders endorsement in 2020 in the primary elections from the left, is now supporting Biden and saying that socialists should vote for Biden. But again, this letter that went around, this people signing it, it was a small amount of people. And I do think the majority of DSA members are actually not in favor of publicly endorsing Biden, although probably many of them will be privately voting for him. So Bread and Roses specifically, they are in theory for a workers' party, but in practice have totally liquidated to the realignment strategy of DSA's right wing. Eric Blanc has formulated something called the dirty break, which I believe Jonah will be talking a little bit more about later. But just a quick background, it essentially proposes kind of the classical Trotskyist entryism, but instead of in a Labor Party, in the Democratic Party, elect a handful of socialists who will then break to form their own party. When and how the break happens, break into what, it's never clear. I don't think Bhaskar Sunkara, who's the editor of Jacobin magazine, and I believe he's a member of Bread and Roses, but if not, he's allied with them. I don't think he ever told AOC she was supposed to break with the Democratic Party. I don't think she knows that. People like AOC are the ones that DSA kind of uses as public relations campaigns to gain new members. But you know, her history has been extremely varied. Coalitionism and horse trading one moment, and then opposing the Pelosi leadership to the next. She accepted a committee appointment from Pelosi in exchange for firing her militant chief of staff, who's a member of this group, Justice Democrats, which follow the Shatman, Harrington, Sanders strategy of realigning the Democratic Party. So yeah, she fired him because of some backroom deal with the Democratic leadership, because he was criticizing Pelosi too much. So the far left critics, they usually couch their criticisms of, you know, AOC and those types of elected officials as a kind of moral outrage, which I think is not really the Marxist way to go about it. I actually blame the DSA intellectuals for not pushing for a program, a Marxist program, and democratic centralism as a mechanism to bind any congressional fraction to the program. There's a serious desire for a quantitative wins over the actual qualitative wins in politics, and there's no conception of operating in the enemy camp, even by those who acknowledge the need for a break with the Democrats. Jacobin is a publication. They know better theoretically. Before 2016, they were pretty consistent on this, but practically find the false victories of coalitionism too seductive. They went all in for Bernie in order to win as many of the 9 to 13 million Bernie voters as possible to their version of socialism. While they personally may have been for Bernie without illusions at first, in the process of tailoring their editorial line to win over a mass audience, they became for Bernie with illusions, and that's reflected within most of the DSA. Just briefly, I want to kind of talk about the history of people trying to form left oppositions within DSA. There's never been a national one that was coherent in any way. There was a caucus called Refoundation that I was a member of briefly that sought to unite revolutionary communists, but there was absolutely no basis for unity except the personal identifier, and it disbanded pretty quickly over some sort of petty drama in its leadership. Its members were a combination of IMT enthusiasts, the Stalinists, the Twitter Stalinists, and other independent communists, but it advocated no route for DSA to become a party or with a Marxist program. One of its members was on the National Political Committee and kind of in a bizarre twist, left DSA in the wake of the 2020 primary elections to support Elizabeth Warren and became even more of a common liberal than even like the Harringtonites. It's kind of wild to see. There are certain like autonomous inspired groups associated with the group Marxist Center that haven't been able to establish a national presence. One is called Emerge, based in New York City, and I believe they have a member on the NPC. One is called Communist Caucus, which is mostly based in East Bay, California. Both are anti-party and kind of direct action fetishists. Back in 2016, there was a left opposition that kind of even had a poor claim to the title because they were kind of a decentralist, anarcho-liberal faction. And they had a couple people on the NPC, but they all resigned. I think they just kind of gave up trying to contest DSA, really. In the general left, it's really easy to find Bernie supporters who now say that they're against electoralism at all. There's a small group called Red Republicans that just formed out of a really remote region in the Rocky Mountains in Boise, Idaho. Their debut was last week, so I can't say much about them, but they've taken up the slogan of the Workers' Party and democratic centralism as well. They had a former Black Panther and person who was actually a former international group member, the kind of Spartacist split, talking about the need for a workers' party. But it seems to be a grouping of self-professed communists from a variety of different tendencies. In San Francisco, there's a broadly Leninist group called Red Star that has a member on the NPC. And they also have a kind of prominent left celebrity who was who fought with the in Rojava there with the Kurds, and has a popular podcast. So small version of celebrity, but for the U.S. left. We invited them to go on the Cosmonaut podcast to discuss their strategy for a DSA, but they told us they hadn't really clarified internally enough to do so. So they don't seem very well organized, and they're, again, only in San Francisco. The CWI split I mentioned earlier, Reform and Revolution, has also taken up the slogan for the Workers' Party and of course the Transitional Program. They're mostly based out of Seattle. So as you can see, there's various left-wing groupings, but they're all not able to organize nationally, and many of them aren't actually very coherent and strategic. There's one group called Collective Power Network that kind of did make waves at the 2019 convention, mostly based out of New Orleans and Washington, D.C., also with some ex-CWI leadership. They're kind of interesting because they kind of existed to promote kind of these sensible organizational demands, like build regional networks of groups of chapters, but they also oppose the bread and roses labor strategy from the left. They're inspired by the third period Communist Party USA labor strategy, but they're also to the right of bread and roses on political strategy. They take an agnostic stance, something that's called the party surrogate that some people have advocated in Jacobin. So basically, in short, there's never really been an attempt by Marxists to struggle for a principled program and democratic centralism within DSA. The far left denounces DSA either because they have beliefs in the false party of a new type rather than a mass party, or they fetishize spontaneity, or both. The leading Marxist factions in DSA have no practical guide to political independence or conception of politics, as acting as a tribune of the people in the enemy camp. And even those who do have a slogan of the Workers' Party don't act nationally. Even smaller groups who have they haven't demonstrated a tactical route to get there, or what the programmatic content of that party should be. However, if this was detailed, if this tactical route was worked out and widely agitated for, it probably would find a lot of sympathizers within the DSA. A few comrades from Cosmonaut are planning a discussion in a couple of weeks here on organizing within the DSA on the basis of promoting a Marxist minimum maximum program and writing resolutions for the next year's convention on binding the endorsed candidates and members to the program. The NPC, the National Political Committee, has actually been planning to draft a platform for the 2021 convention and just sent out applications to sit on the subcommittee. I applied and I got accepted because I've written on the programmatic question before for Cosmonaut. So that'll be an interesting struggle to be a part of over the next year. I think the biggest challenge for Marxists in DSA will be to firstly draft a program that is acceptable to the organization on a wide scale, but not on the basis of the politics of its lowest common denominator. The second would be adopting a truly democratic centralism that makes the program binding. This won't be popular with DSA members because it will inevitably mean fewer electoral victories. In 2019, a resolution that would have acted as a binding minimum program for all endorsed candidates failed. There was someone arguing, oh, I'm from the South, and if you do this, people in the South have a terrible view of the word socialism, and they're going to be scared of us, and we won't be able to do any work. And it's apparently swayed people to vote against the resolution. I thought it was a just shameful thing, probably the worst thing that happened at the convention. But if Marxists patiently struggle for these things, there is a possibility of constructing the building blocks of a mass Marxist party in the United States. There's a small opening, and we may as well take it. We might fail, we probably will fail, but we may as well take the opportunity. And with that, I'll send it over to Jonah.
Okay, thanks very much for that. And yes, Jonah, are you ready?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so
carry on then. Go on, carry on, and we'll
do. Yes, thanks for having me on. And just before I start, just let me say, if I get a little bit grandiose or melodramatic or shoot off at the mouth, just forgive me for it.
Jonah, a bit louder, Jonah.
Oh,
Jonah, a bit louder, please.
Oh, can you hear me now? How about now? Okay, excellent. Yeah, I was just going to say, forgive me if I get a little melodramatic or shoot off at the mouth. Times have us all neurotic here, and I'm definitely no exception. So I think it might be good just to give a little bit of background on why we're having these debates in the first place, on whether to stay in the Democratic Party or not, whether to do a dirty break or a clean, immediate break, and so on. I mean, why on earth would we even want to share a party with Joe Biden? How could anyone think that that's a road to power? And obviously, just to understand why, just got to run through how our political system here functions. You know, the American approach to capitalist rule is basically just drown democracy in elections, give people so many things to vote for that they don't know what they should actually be doing to contest for power, make the political system as convoluted and fragmented as possible. And we have that in our legislature. You all have heard this before, you know, it's which is more powerful, the House or the Senate? Really the Senate, but their terms are staggered. They last for 6 years. Every state gets equal representation, so that's just a handout to rotten boroughs like Wyoming, just all white rural states. It's incredibly undemocratic. Learned that from you, Daniel. So the question is, which should socialists run for? Should they target the House or the Senate or the presidency? It's hard to form a unified strategy or choose what institution to target. And one reason that the Bernie campaign popped off was because it was a national struggle for power. And now that we don't have any national political figures with that kind of constituency, it's hard to think about what that struggle could look like now. And we have this political incoherency at the state level too. They don't realize it, but in some ways, America is really an anarchist dream come true because every state has autonomy. They get to control every level of the electoral process, from presidential races to city council. You get to elect everything from governor to local dog catcher. And a lot of states, they have like these Swiss style ballot initiatives that let people propose and vote on legislation as citizens. And you would think that that would be a good thing, but it's usually not, because they require so many signatures to put initiatives on the ballot that it's usually only rich lobbyists who can afford it. So I'm from Florida. I got my ballot in the mail a couple weeks ago. And this year we had so many initiatives that my ballot was like 4 pages long, and it was so bulky that you have to put 2 stamps on it instead of 1 to send it through. And a lot of people are going to not get their ballots sent in just because of that. And so this incoherency, that fragmentation, it seeps all the way down into our political parties, because our parties are public utilities. The state, it regulates every aspect of their structure. Voters, they can register with any party that they want when they choose to vote, when they register to vote. And you can't kick them out of the party. It's just a legal affiliation that you register with. The primary elections where parties choose their candidates are state run. So technically, I could run for governor of Florida as an Antifa Democrat, and legally they couldn't stop me. So it's really tempting to DSA to play the game that way. Why not just bite the bullet and be Democrats just to get on the ballot? Because there are states that make it almost impossible to run as a third party candidate. They have absurd requirements. You have to collect 100,000 signatures in counties across the state, run a presidential candidate from coast to coast, get 5% of the vote, or you're just kicked off the ballot right away. And to run as a Democrat or Republican, it will be just collect 1,000 signatures and sign right here. So why not game the system? The DSA has some dedicated cadre members in state legislatures right now. They were elected as nominal Democrats, but they are Marxists. And the Dirty Breakers, they have a point about it being a pragmatic move. What they don't realize is just this, that the establishment Democrats don't control the ballot line, but they control the brand name. When you put on a Coca-Cola shirt, it gets really hard to criticize Coca-Cola and look credible at the same time. It creates these divided loyalties in the movement. It makes it harder to establish ourselves as a distinct political current. And the Dirty Breakers, they're not making it any easier because they aren't setting tough standards for the candidates that they endorse. The criteria that they just pushed through back in 2018 for the national organization, they're basically just call yourself a socialist, be against all forms of oppression, and commit to using your office to foster a working class organization. Whatever that means, they call it class struggle elections. We'll back candidates who support them, who support class struggle elections in Democratic primaries. And one day in the distant future, we will press the button and just break from the Democratic Party. And we've never had clear criteria on when that day comes. Is it when we get 10 million voters who are voting for us each year? Is it when we have 10 people elected to Congress? Is it once we reform the electoral laws to make our electoral system more equitable? We have no standards, no timeline, no goals or benchmarks. And so what's happening in practice is we're stumping for people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who have really loose, weak connections to DSA, people who are more committed to the Democratic Party than we are. And we can bicker and argue all day about whether they're good or bad or whether their strategy will work. I don't know, who knows what's good or bad, but it does, if we're trying to build a coherent socialist movement, it's muddying the waters, it's going to confuse people, and it goes against our goals. So yeah, there's been a debate in DSA lately about whether Bernie Sanders should try to become labor secretary under Biden. And that's something he's pursuing right now. He has a shot at getting it. And we've heard real critiques from people in DSA, even from Bhaskar Sankara, of that approach, of that coalitionist approach. And while it's good to see DSA members critiquing that, the entire argument's just a moot point because we don't have any say in what Bernie does. We don't have any institutions that can hold him accountable. We haven't made any sort of effort to develop them. in the past few years. We've hitched our wagon to people who are just completely unaccountable to us. We're just addicted to Democrats. And it's not because the dirty breakers are stupid. They're not at all. If anything, they're too clever. It's because we're working in this political system that encourages incoherent thinking. And so to break the addiction, we really have to cut through the crap and come up with clear political goals and link them to immediate actions that DSA can take instead of just these broad, vague principles. And so, yeah, our faction, our little orthodox Marxist group that Cosmonaut's trying to set up in DSA, we're toying with ideas for how to do that. And I've kind of compiled a few of them together, just different things that our members have tossed out. I think what we really need to do is put DSA on a 12-step program to break the Democrat addiction. And so step one would just be declare political independence. Put out a statement, even if it's just internal, saying that DSA considers itself an independent socialist party and expects its members to conduct themselves accordingly. Now, we wouldn't be able to get legal recognition or ballot access under a clear name on the ballot. We wouldn't be able to get that right away in most states. But it doesn't matter. It really shouldn't matter whether we have legal recognition as a party by the state or not. You know, I'm sure that Lenin and the Bolsheviks did not have legal recognition from the Tsar when they first organized. We should define for ourselves what a party is and not the capitalist state. We'd like to see DSA start to refer to itself as the socialist movement or the movement for socialism or something similar. And then we could start speaking in terms of the socialist movement demands this, the socialist movement demands that. We take responsibility for defining what socialism is in the United States, defining it to the American public. And there's just no other organization that can step up and take responsibility for right now. Take responsibility for that right now. Yeah, I mean, it's easy to say it would be arrogant for DSA to just claim a monopoly over the term, but the other socialist groups in the United States, they're just tiny, they're sects, and they just wouldn't be able to speak as one block like we can. So we have to step up and take that responsibility, because we don't claim the brand of what socialism is right now. It's going to be the politicians like AOC who do it for us. We've hitched our wagon to them, and now they're getting to define what socialism is instead of us. And so all this, it might sound symbolic, but it really does matter, because if we consider ourselves a party, that really forces DSA members to take themselves and their behavior more seriously. You know, I was a member of Tallahassee DSA a couple of years ago back in Florida, and we had some members purge other members over this really petty factional dispute. We were fighting with Maoists in the area. And one of the people who led the organization just said, you know, it doesn't matter if we purge people. We're just a nonprofit. We're a volunteer organization. We shouldn't worry about it that much. We don't need to have due process for members. It's a volunteer group, nothing more. We declare ourselves a party, you know, that you can't make that excuse anymore. We're not a nonprofit. We're not a social club. We're an independent movement for socialism. A small movement, but we'll build it up. And so step two would just be hold annual conventions. Right now, we only have national conventions every 2 years, and that sets the tempo. It sets the tempo too slow for deliberation as an organization, because annual conventions, that would let us constantly reflect and readjust our strategy. And that's really important because the political situation here has become very, very volatile. And so I'm sure there would be budget concerns about meeting that often, but I think we'd be able to navigate them pretty well. I mean, we have Zoom nowadays. There are cheaper options. Yeah, so step three would just be form statewide organizations. Right now, we have this tiny national organization, and it's managing 235 local chapters. It's an absolute mess, really difficult to coordinate. And I think that if you really knock the chapters' heads together and force them to collaborate more, that would alleviate some of the burden on national. And it would also be a rejection of this extreme localism that's held back DSA. Like Parker said, we've had a lot of anarcho-liberals. They called themselves the Build Caucus a while back. And they just gin up resentment of the national organization and demand that all power be given to the locals, decentralize everything, have no unified program or national agenda. And without realizing it, they're really playing into this old conservative idea that everything in this country should be solved locally, one city council at a time, one town at a time. And that's not going to cut it if we're trying to build a national movement. And so much policy is made at the state level here that we should really be strategizing and contesting for power at that level too. The Republicans and Democrats, they have state level parties, so we should have them too. 4 would be nurture a committed membership base. Right now, our dues system, it's way too flexible. You can pay out 67 cents a month and still be considered a member and get a vote in your local chapter. And now that's really rare. You have to enter it in a form. Most members don't do that. They pay out something more reasonable voluntarily. But the option to be a grifter member, it's always there. And there are anarchists that we have right now who they're whining about even the 67 cents, about it being too exclusive to working class people. These dues, they cost less than a case of beer, but they talk about them as though they're some kind of horrendous poll tax. We should really be doing the opposite of scrapping dues. We should set a more reasonable minimum and have suggestions for people in different income brackets. And we should have a policy that only active cadre get a vote in how DSAs run, and have an onboarding and education process for new prospective members. I think that, if we start asking for more serious membership commitment, that's another way that we start to take ourselves more seriously as a party, and we start to shoulder more responsibility. And there will obviously be a balance that we'll have to strike. We don't want to become another exclusive set that demands way too much of members. We want a mass base, but we should definitely step it up. 5 would be adopt a political platform. Probably don't even need to include that anymore. It's a moot point because DSA is already on that apparently. But we'll push to make it a good one, and we want it to be something that the organization takes seriously too, not just something that gets copied and pasted on the website, but something that every member learns about, something that we're pushing and marketing to the public as a whole. And really glad that you got that committee spot, Parker. I'm sure you'll do a great job of it. So step 6, run dedicated cadre for office. We should be running gifted organizers who are active with their local chapters and people who are pledged to uphold the party platform and not just run as individuals, but run with discipline. And whenever they get elected, they would form an independent socialist caucus in the legislature. They wouldn't caucus with Democrats. And that means they probably wouldn't get any legislative committee appointments, but that's okay. I guess our opponents will say we're useless backbenchers, that only they can bring home the bacon to their districts. But I think we can probably just counter that by pointing out all the ways that they've backstabbed their communities in the past. And we can promise to be relentless advocates for those communities that they've ignored. We can show that we care about the districts we're working in by not taking more than an average worker's salary, by really focusing on providing constituent services. And our candidates, they could be involved in local organizing efforts too. And, it's just so cliched on the left to say that electoral work it doesn't matter, or it's unimportant, it's an inferior good. And we should do it, but we should do it half-assed. And we don't buy that. We don't buy it at all. It goes hand in hand with economic struggle. It's crucial for carving out a mass base. Well, we learned that from you guys. 7, stop endorsing outside the party. That goes hand in hand with 6. Once we have a training program for this new approach to electoral work, we should just flat out stop campaigning for people who aren't active, committed DSA members. And in practice, that probably means we would have to distance ourselves from the entire squad in Congress, but it's necessary. We've just been tailing these figures who, for better or worse, they're not loyal to us. And when we let them be our public spokespersons, it just muddies the water. And so we turn off the faucet of endorsements. And the only exception that I can think of, it would just be making agreements with other independent left groups that are trying to challenge the two-party system. One thing that we've seen that's really interesting lately is that some former Bernie staffers are trying to set up this new big tent populist progressive party. They're going to call it the People's Party. And they have some professional political operatives and some real momentum behind them right now. I don't think that their strategy is going to work. It's incoherent. I think it sets the too wide, too big, but some short-term collaboration with groups like that, it might still be good to try to win reforms to break up the two-party system. And just it doesn't really make sense to be competing and splitting the vote with other people who are committed to political independence. If we can find room for collaboration, that would be good. So step 8 would just be choose ballot lines at the state level. There are states where we can set up third parties and run independents really easily. There's somewhere it's actually easier. Here in New Jersey, where I live now, you can run an independent for Congress with just 150 signatures. That's even less than running a normal candidate. So there are these soft spots that we can target and run independents on an independent ballot line. And wherever we have those easy spots, wherever the ballot access requirements are equal, we should be running as independent socialists. People can talk about those splitting. I've talked about it before, but we really do have to aggressively push the idea that we have a right to run our candidates wherever we like, just like any other capitalist party, just like the two major parties. And honestly, I think even where the ballot access lines are unequal, if we can even just get 1 or 2 candidates on the ballot as independents, we should still go for it, because building up that independent branding is really important. But yeah, once we have state level organizations that know the statewide laws, we'll be able to make those judgment calls more decisively, and we'll do it consistently across an entire state instead of just letting each local do its own thing. And that will be good for making our messaging more crisp. So there does come a point where it's almost impossible to run as an independent in certain states. So Georgia, for example, they require so many signatures for independent candidates that I don't think anyone's been on the ballot as an independent since the 1960s, not since the 60s. So, but at the same time, they have this open primary system where the party elections, you don't even have to register as a Democrat to vote in the Democratic primary. So in states like Georgia, a dirty break strategy of running candidates in the Democratic Party, or maybe some socialist Republicans, I don't even know. But that strategy might make a little bit more sense in states like Georgia. And what we'll do differently if we do pursue that course is we won't just talk on and on about some vague break in the distant future. We'll have an immediate commitment to political independence. So the moment that we take office, those candidates will renounce their party affiliation, just join the rest of the socialist backbenchers as rabble-rousers. And because of the really incoherent electoral system that we have here, they won't even be able to stop us unless they reform their state-level electoral laws. And I'm sure that they will do that eventually. They'll crack down, but that will take time. And by then, hopefully, we'll build a base that can fight back against it. So 9 would just be target the House of Representatives. It's the closest thing that we have to a parliamentary body in the United States. Its members are elected every 2 years. Everyone's up for election every 2 years. So it's more democratic than the Senate. They're elected in local districts only 700,000 people per district. So relatively small population size for federal offices. It's huge, but it's still easier to contest in the presidency, and we don't have anything near the capacity to run a presidential candidate in the near future. And it's a national body. So when we run for the House, we get to speak to a national audience and build a national constituency. And we get to point to the top in a way that these local bids don't let us. We can point out the ways that the entire constitutional order has just failed us. And that'll let us kind of cut through the reactionary localism of our political culture. All these illusions of redeeming America, one city council seat at a time. And it's not a trade-off entirely, because if we have national spokespersons, that boosts our public profile, and that will help our state and local candidates that we keep running. Because we have that national visibility, when we go after those high-level offices, it will help raise our public profile, and that will be important. One thing that Parker's talked about a lot lately is it's starting out in the deep blue districts. So some of the urban districts here they're basically these one-party Democratic fiefdoms where the Democrats come out with 70, 80, 90% of the vote in every general election. And so if we go there first, we can just kind of dodge all the initial concerns and fretting about vote splitting, just sort of build up our capacity as an organization and learn how to run good independent bids. And we can really try to create these localized two-party systems where we're the main opposition to the Democrats instead of the Republicans. So we build up capacity there, and then we expand outwards. We aggressively pursue every office that we can when we get the opportunity, once we have the ability to do so. We don't fret about vote splitting in public. So moving into specific political demands, 10 would be organized for electoral reform, aggressively organized for electoral reform. Our candidates, they should be demanding that the states scrap all of their unfair ballot access laws, let any organized group that wants to be on the ballot do so. No more state regulation of party structures, free association, get on the ballot with whatever, 100 signatures, make it fair and easy. Fight for ranked choice voting, proportional representation in Congress, really just any reform that weakens the two-party cartel, makes things easier on us. And remember those initiatives that made my ballot heavy? It's usually just the eccentric millionaires who push those through, but I do think that dues-based membership organization like DSA might be able to get them on the ballot too. And so we might be able to use those to go over the politicians' heads and mobilize voters to vote for electoral reform themselves, or at least take a decent stab at it. And where we can't get candidates on the ballot easily, that might be a good alternative thing to push as a party, these ballot initiatives. That would be a good way to build up our base. Step 11, shoot down war budgets. Classic socialist movement legislatures, learned it from you again. The left Democrats in Congress, they've been really pretty spineless about voting up war budgets, appropriation bills that just jack up military spending. We reject them. We set ourselves apart. And that's one more reason to target the House, because it lets us contest foreign policy. It lets us denounce imperialism in a way that's credible and direct, more direct than what we can do locally and at the state level. And so finally, step 12 is one to really set us apart, to really try to bring the right's worst nightmare to life. Left Democrats, AOC, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, they're demanding a new deal, a Green New Deal. Well, I think DSA should be demanding a new union, demanding a new constitution developed by mass popular participation. Because in a free society, everyone gets a say in the political system that they live under. And that's not what happened when our constitution was written. Women had no say, Black people had no say, poor whites, working class people had no say. So we demand that the progressive majority of our country be given the right to determine its future. We demand a constitution that guarantees real democracy, that guarantees majority rule, housing, healthcare, economic rights, all the rights that have been neglected in the society that we're living under right now. And we demand that Congress initiate that process. But if it doesn't, we say the people have a right to do it themselves, and they will. And yeah, so that's what we'll yammer about in the legislatures if we can. And there are these arcane legal theories that are arguing that it's actually true, that the Constitution, that it can be reformed by referendum, by popular majority votes. Pretty obscure, but those arguments have been made, and we're more than happy to invoke them as needed to serve our purposes. And I really think, we think that if DSA raises that demand, it really establishes our political independence in a really public and edgy way. We put ourselves in just open opposition to the constitutional order. And the Trumpers, the QAnon people, they just fume over this socialist plot to overthrow the Constitution. And the Democrats frantically condemn us. They tinker with their minor reforms, but they try to distance themselves from us as much as possible. And our rhetoric, it alienates most people. But we strike a chord with a sizable minority, and we build up from there with political independence. So yeah, that's the 12-point program that we're tinkering with right now. We'll be lucky if we get 2 of them passed at the convention. We'll be lucky if we get 1 of them passed. And I do think DSA, it's moving in a better direction. I'm proud to be a member of it. I'm glad that it's moving forward. And we'll keep pushing it towards independent politics. And thank you all for helping us with that, because we wouldn't even have that goal in mind without Weekly Worker. So thanks.
Well, thank you, comrades Parker and Jonah there. So we're going to go into discussion now.